Hey, you guys. Thanks for joining me today. So, we're actually going to be talking about at the very center point, obedience. So, the text I'm going to be focusing in on first before we do anything else is Luke 22:39 to 46. I'm going to read it and then we're going to chat about it and then some things we can glean. Then, accompanied by the disciples, Jesus left the upstairs room and went as usual to the Mount of Olives. There, he told them, "Pray that you will not give in to temptation." He walked away about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." Then an angel from heaven appeared and strengthened him. He prayed more fervently, and he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell to the ground like great drops of blood. At last he stood up again and returned to the disciples, only to find them asleep, exhausted from grief. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray, so that you will not give in to temptation." So you can also compare it with Matthew as well. John. So you can look at the other gospel accounts. In some cases, you will see that he prays twice. And at the very center of the message is his obedience in that moment. So he is about to face the cross and not my will, God, but yours. Right. So in that moment, there was obviously this tension that was taking place. He doesn't want the cup of suffering. He doesn't want to go through what he knew was coming. And yet he knew, not my will, but yours. So what is the practical application for us to understand in this? Because a very large percentage of us are not enduring moments of life or death situations. Some will, maybe some will in the future. But right now, generally speaking, many of you may not be facing circumstances like that, but you're facing other places where you have to really look at the situation and ask yourself, whose will am I abiding by in this situation? And I can say for me, an example that I do want to share is being in a position at work, for example, where I was working in a shelter and there were a lot of safety and health issues that were taking place. And I was appointed by the Lord to be in a health and safety position as well as do my normal duties. I did not want this position. I cared about health and safety, but I was not in a position to desire to be fully responsible for it for employees. And in my situation and in my environment, some of our situations were life threatening. And they resulted in significant body injury for both client and staff. Okay. So it could be like someone trying to stab another person. It could be a staff member being physically punched and losing consciousness. There were someone getting spit on their face, right? So there were, and maybe they had some kind of communicable disease. So I was not just dealing with like sometimes like mild issues like ergonomics. I was dealing with the safety, the genuine safety of the people who were in the environment. And it was not my will to do that. And yet it was God's will for me to do that. And through that, he really trained me in being able to stand up and communicate in difficult moments. And I was harassed. I was slandered. I lost opportunities to work. I lost promotions. I was never able to be promoted in that environment. In fact, they would disqualify me from every opportunity of promotion before. They wouldn't even look at my resume. They were so angry with me in this position. And the interesting thing about it was what I heard consistently from people who I did provide support to, which was, "I've never seen someone operate in health and safety the way you did." That wasn't by my own accord. because God was leading me. He was guiding me. He was showing me what to do. He was telling me how to act in particular situations. And he gave me particular abilities to respond in those moments. So much so that later on, I moved into a position where I had multiple locations to be responsible for. And this was during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm not only just dealing with those initial concerns, now I'm also dealing with people who are dying because of fentanyl overdoses in residential spaces. And I'm also dealing with the very present risk of COVID-19 infecting people who have compromised immune systems. And I was not prepared for this. I did not know how to handle this. And yet, God, in his sovereignty, appointed me into that position and was able to use me to do what I needed to do in there. But there was an obedience that was required on my part that was very difficult at certain times, because there were moments where I was harassed, I was slandered, I was ostracized, I was targeted on numerous occasions for things. They wouldn't offer me shifts and work even if I had the seniority to do that. There were so many things that happened as reprisal as a product of me being in this role, but God still used it. And in your life, you are going to find yourself as a believer having to contend with that. Do I want to drink this cup of suffering that the Lord is handing me? And this is not the only time where you see Jesus reference, can you drink, like, about drinking a cup of suffering. He also says that when, I want to say the sons of thunder asked who can sit beside him in heaven, right? They're like, oh, can we sit beside you? And he said, can you drink the cup that I drink? And they said, yeah, we're able. And he said, all right, well, anyways, I'll put the scripture up just so you can see it briefly. At the end of the day, there is this metaphorical cup, so to speak, right? That he's referencing. He references it in this particular passage in Luke 22 and in the gospel accounts before Jesus goes to the cross. And you also see it as well when there is this like desire to be with him in heaven, to sit beside him, right? So with that being said, as believers, we are going to have to face the reality that we are going to drink the cup too. Now, does this mean I understand, do people like vary in the degree of which they get? I would assume so, because people are in varying situations and they go through different trials, but it is relevant to the person and their journey and what God is doing with them, right? So it's not a point of comparison, right? Like my cup is more filled with suffering than yours. No, that's not for us to decide. It's not for us to compare or look or examine. The fact is, we all got to drink a cup of suffering. Can we accept God's will, not mine? There is a reaction when we speak what God says. There is a reaction when we stand up for the gospel. There is a reaction that comes from people when we are not willing to compromise, when we actually walk righteously, right? Blessed are those who suffer for righteousness' sake. Blessed are those who are pure in heart. Blessed are those who will suffer persecution, right? Blessed are people who are meek. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. The Beatitudes I'm plugging here right now. Okay. But to divert, right? We are at the very center point. We are called to be ambassadors of Christ. We are called to follow Christ. We are called to operate in a way that is not consistent with my will, but his will, right? And there are times where that may seem in certain places like easier, right? Oh, well, in this area, I can kind of get on board with God saying, but in this area is a lot more difficult, right? In this area, this costs me something. This costs me friendships. In my case, it cost me any level of respect or promotion in my place of work. And to be clear, before I was in this role, I was I was on the trajectory of promotion. Like I was doing trainings for teams. I was being cited as a person who was being trained in a management position. I was speaking in large settings to people, and being identified as a very good staff by my managers. And as soon as I went into this role, it was gone. I was now like the dirt under their shoe, because now I was not walking and doing what they wanted me to do anymore. Now I was in a different position, and I had a responsibility in that position, and I was unwilling to compromise my responsibility in that position, no matter the pressure that they put. But I did eventually get to a point where I did want to leave, right? The reprisal was so significant every day. Right. So there is a cost. Doesn't mean I didn't still end up in a different capacity, still doing it. Absolutely. Like I said, I went from a single location to multiple locations, but the cost, it was bitter. It was bitter having to deal with those consequences every single day. And it showed me something really important about being, number one, obedient, and number two, like things can get really bad. Things can get really bad when you are walking in alignment with what God says. And not necessarily bad in the sense of like, I'm losing the situation, like the situation is going bad for me, but in like the eyes of the physical situation, it doesn't always seem to be working to my advantage, right? Like, oh, I want to do this, and yet I have to stand here. I have to speak this. I need to do that, right? And so at the very center point again of our faith is, you are my friends if you do as I have commanded you. So you have a choice. You have a choice as a believer to go your own way, to do what you want to do, to follow culture, to follow people, to follow your emotions, to follow everything else, your comfort. Oh my goodness. Can I tell you about that? It is so hard to step out of that place of comfort, right? Because it's so much easier. There's so much less friction and difficulty when we walk according to our own will. The way of destruction is broad, but we are called to walk the narrow path. And the narrow path is following Jesus, is picking up our cross. It's not about my will, it's about his. So that means at the very center point, my life ought to be a consistent demonstration of not my will, but his. The submitted believer should be a person who you can look and say, this is a person who sacrifices their will on a regular basis, knowing what God has called them to do. And I do genuinely believe that we can get to a point, right? Like as we spend more time with him, we become more aligned, right? That's what prayer does. It helps us align with God's will. The time that we spend talking to him and conversing with him and in fellowship with him and delighting in him, we align into his will. But it does not mean that there are not going to be points where you're saying, let this cup pass. Let this pass. There are moments where I want it, so let it pass. I can't handle this. I can't do this. I've hit my limit. There's no more left in me to give. And yet we're still called to keep walking and to follow and drink.